Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. So I hope you all had a pleasant lunch break. To kick off today's afternoon session, we're very pleased to begin with a brief introduction from our guests from the United States. So first, we'd like to welcome Dr. Karl Pazdernik, Chief Data Scientist and Team Lead at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and Research Assistant Professor at North Carolina State University. We're also delighted to have Ms. Cindy Gonzales, Deputy Director of the Data Science Institute at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, joining us as well. They will briefly introduce themselves and share how their work connects to AI safety and international collaboration. So now, please join me in giving them a warm round of applause as we welcome them to the stage. Welcome.
All right. Thank you for the kind introduction. And first, I want to just start by thanking our incredible hosts, National Taiwan University, the AI Center of Excellence. Really the hospitality that we've received since we arrived here has been pretty much unparalleled. So we really appreciate all that you've done for inviting us here and allowing us to be a part of this activity and experience with you all. All right, so today I'm going to first introduce essentially the topic of why we're here today, to discuss AI safety and the workshop that we're delivering here today. Our focus is a little bit different than maybe you would see in industry, but I noticed the conversation, discussion this morning, and there are a lot of parallels that I was able to pull out of it. We definitely consider challenges with AI models in the same way in determining when to use them and how to use them, and I'm hoping that you all we'll see some of those parallels as well over the course of the next 2 days. I'm going to skip over the agenda as you all have it, but we are in the portion of introducing ourselves. So in the spirit of introducing ourselves, this is who we are. This project was essentially started by the US Department of State, where their mission is to protect and promote US security, prosperity, and democratic values, shaping international environments in which all Americans can thrive. As national labs, we have 2 national labs here present, Lawrence Livermore National Lab and Pacific Northwest National Lab. It is our mission to help our US government sponsors, in this case Department of State, and our particular lab missions are really aligned with promoting science. And so Livermore's mission is to enable US security and global stability and resilience by empowering multidisciplinary teams to pursue bold and innovative science and technology. And very similarly, Pacific Northwest National Lab's mission is to transform the world through courageous discovery and innovation by advancing scientific frontiers and providing solutions to critical national needs. So a little bit more about our partner agency at the U.S. Department of State. This is a particular subset of Department of State, the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Fund. With us today, we have Simon Nash here in the front, who is with the Department of State, and he is a data scientist. Their agency is a contingency fund set up by Congress under the Freedom Support Act of 1992. And really the mission is, as you would expect for non-proliferation, it's to stop the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. And so NDF has special authorities to fill gaps, address rapidly emerging threats, including those that result from the malicious use of emerging technologies, and that's why we're here today, because AI is an emerging technology. And it has the potential to enable all sorts of capabilities, great innovation, some positive, and the potential for some negative. And so this project aims to really aid AI developers by increasing their security around their processes and their systems so that these systems do not proliferate WMDs. All right, so that is our government agency. Here are the national laboratories. So if you're not as familiar with national laboratories, this was all established during the World War, during the Second World War for the development of nuclear weapons. You can kind of see a host of them throughout the US. The 2 that are highlighted a little bit larger here, Pacific Northwest in the northern northwestern part of the US, and Lawrence Livermore in the south. We basically address, as I mentioned, a variety of scientific challenges, and we partner together to address those challenges. In particular, at PNNL, our national security mission is in reducing the threat from weapons of mass effect. And so you can kind of see here the variety of ways in which we address this problem and what we consider as potential threats. So nuclear nonproliferation is one of them, and you can see we have that history in nuclear materials as well. Today our focus is more on chemical and biological threats and the threat of artificial intelligence. And so you can kind of see that here in two of the quadrants, where we have areas that focus on chem bio detection and forensics, and artificial intelligence and data science. Encompassing that, we also focus on other forms of threat like cybersecurity and systems engineering, which all become a component of AI safety as you're deploying these models.
Okay, and from Lawrence Livermore National Lab, our mission is to strengthen the nation's security through world-class science, technology, and engineering. What's unique about Lawrence Livermore is we're actually home to some unique facilities. So on the Livermore campus, we have the National Ignition Facility, which is the first and currently only facility in the world to achieve fusion ignition. We are home to the #1 fastest supercomputer in the entire world in Livermore, California also. And we actually have world-class advanced manufacturing labs, along with a unique capability, which Brian Mayer will talk about tomorrow, which is the Forensic Science Center, is a unique offering and requires chem expertise to help detect weapons of mass destruction. Some of our focus areas are highlighted on this slide. We focus on nuclear deterrence, threat preparedness and response, energy security, and multi-domain deterrence. These are really general, and we are exploring the intersection of these missions and artificial intelligence technologies. One thing to mention is most of our missions have a growing focus on large-scale data analytics. And during my talk, I'll talk a little bit about dual-use implications of technologies such as artificial intelligence.
All right, so that brings us to why are we here? Now that you know who we are, what are we doing here? Well, we are delivering a workshop with these particular objectives. It's to support the development of safety standards using evaluations and red teaming. We'll kind of cover those as basic standards that we use, at least in our national labs and within the US, and talk about some of the limitations and future directions in those forms of evaluations and standards. We'll also have an opportunity for hands-on activities. Some of you have provided your email address and will be given access to the compute environment to actually perform hands-on activities in Python, where you'll get to actually test these benchmarks and evaluation metrics to determine how safe we can measure an AI model to be. In particular, for us, our definition of safety is really with the malicious use of a system to proliferate WMDs, in particular ChemBio, but that is really a critical component for each one of you to determine what safety means to you in your industry or in your job. It can cover, obviously, ChemBio threats, but as we saw today, there are other concerns in the housing market, financial market, where there are other threats that could be posed by AI. So we are going to review a variety of material to give you kind of the knowledge to be able to apply some of these methods, talking about AI safety and benchmarking, red teaming. We're going to cover topics of translation, and then, of course, put it in the context of chemical and biological threats. And I mentioned the hands-on activity. Okay, so here is the team that is with us here today. The team is a little bit larger across both national labs, but here is the staff that is with us either in person or who will be presenting virtually. So Cindy Gonzales and myself, we are the co-principal investigators respective at each lab. And we already had a wonderful introduction, so I don't necessarily need to go further into that. In terms of our domain expertise, we have Brian Mayer, who's an analytical chemist, and the Deputy Director for the Forensic Science Center. Andy Lin, who is our computational biologist and our SME in the biology domain, also a senior data scientist. Present with us is Jonathan Tu, who's a senior data scientist, and we also have some senior staff and machine learning researchers back home, Brian Bartholdson from Lawrence Livermore and Lauren Phillips from PNNL. All right, and we also, if you hadn't noticed during the introduction, have some guest speakers that have graciously decided to join us in our mission. So we have our guest, MITRE. MITRE is a nonprofit organization. As such, acts in the public interest by delivering objective, cost-effective solutions to many of the world's biggest challenges. It is much like the national labs. They operate FFRDCs, which are federally funded research and development centers. That is really the same strategy and same operating procedure as the national labs. And with us today, we have Tabitha Coulter, who is the Atlas Community Lead, and Julian got it, who is the AI engineer. All right. And much like the national labs, MITRE is focused on powering advances in national defense, aviation safety, GPS, financial systems, healthcare, some that are a little bit more aligned with some of our industry speakers here today. And so to give a little bit more background in the type of research that MITRE performs, they operate these FFRDCs, focused on national security engineering, aviation, as I mentioned, healthcare, homeland security systems. And because they are FFRDCs, as we are, what helps is that it's free from conflict of interest. The purpose is not to create profit or compete with commercial entities, but rather to provide public good. All right, and with that, I will say thank you, and we will go on to the next session.
All right, thank you both for your joint presentation. So moving on, we're pleased to continue with our next presentation from Ms. Cindy Gonzales, who will share further insights on the topic of why does AI safety matter, defining AI evolution methods, red teaming, benchmarks, and the current landscape of the field. So let's welcome her once again as she takes us through the important discussion. Please take it away.
All right, thank you, everybody. So as mentioned, I'm Cindy Gonzales. I serve a number of roles at the lab. One of the roles that I serve is as the Deputy Director for the Data Science Institute, setting strategic direction for AI applications at the lab. I also serve as a group leader for the Intelligent Detection, Exploitation, and Analysis group, which uses AI tools and applies them to missions related to national security. And I also run a handful of projects that focus on capability assessments of large language models as they apply to national security domains. One thing that I want to mention when we talk about AI safety is capability and really the dual use implication of that word. So capability can mean how good something is at doing something, but it can also mean how bad something is at doing something also. And so understanding that there can be a trade-off sometimes, especially when we're talking about scientific innovation, for example, is these models can be really good at helping us learn new topics in biology and chemistry, but if used by the wrong people, could also accelerate the production of weapons of mass destruction. And so understanding the dual use implication of large language models is something that the US government is investing in. I lead one of those projects at LLNL, and so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why does AI safety matter. So our agenda today is just to go through what is AI safety, how are we defining it. I'm going to give a few real-world examples and give a current state of the domain, and then talk broadly about the rest of the talks in this workshop will focus on what can we do to really help address AI safety. Just to give you the bottom line up front here, so the consequences of using AI without considering safety can be catastrophic. It can result in reputation and financial loss and even the loss of human lives, which we'll talk about a little bit today. AI safety, as we define it in this talk, refers to measures that ensure AI systems are designed, developed, and deployed responsibly to minimize potential risks and maximize benefits for humanity. Responsible AI includes establishing principles, guidelines, and governance meant to ensure appropriate use of AI in a way that minimizes unintended societal, organizational, or personal harms, which is a difficult thing to do, as we've talked a lot about today. Understanding and measuring how an AI system is performing on critical tasks can be an important first step to understanding their capabilities. And working alongside domain experts is actually one thing that I do pretty regularly in my job, especially as we're assessing capabilities. So, you know, working alongside AI engineers, AI developers, and working alongside the domain experts that you have in-house to understand the capabilities of your systems can be an important first step in measuring the safety of the system. As we all know, LLM capabilities are increasing at unprecedented rates. So as mentioned earlier, ChatGPT first was released in roughly 2022. It was released in November 2022, and it really revolutionized the natural language processing world. And since then, it has gotten increasingly capable on large benchmark data sets like the MMLU, which we'll talk about in the evaluation and benchmarking portion of this talk. But as the capabilities increase, so does the risk of these models. And we'll demonstrate that through a couple of real-world examples. The first is AI mimicking human behavior and acting like a human can be really, really helpful if you're creating a chatbot, for example. You want to have the interaction with a chatbot be just like a human, but on the other side of that, what you're creating is somebody that is really good, or something that is really good at mimicking human behavior and can be used to enable scams and cyber crimes. So here are headlines, recent headlines making the news. Scam emails and phishing are hard to catch because AI is so good at generating human-like content. Romance scams are actually scaling up globally. And beyond phishing, there's also just the general enablement of cybercrime. And we're not just talking about individual citizens that are affected by this. There are actually large companies that are being affected by this also. So I included a headline here. A British engineering giant, Arup, was actually the victim of a $25 million deepfake scam, which we talked about in the panel session earlier today. And I pulled a quote from this article because I found it to be really disturbing. And the quote says, Hong Kong police said in February that during the elaborate scam, the employee, a financial worker, was duped into attending a video call with people that he believed were the chief financial officer and other members of the staff, but all of whom turned out to be deepfake recreations. The worker decided to put aside his doubts after the video call because the other people in attendance had looked and sounded just like colleagues he recognized, and he agreed to send roughly $25 million to this scamming company. So we're already seeing large-scale effects of the ability for these systems to mimic human behavior, and how that can have, again, dual-use implications, and they can be really good at scamming people too. Another thing is there is this company called Character AI. Character AI basically takes an available large language model and gives it a persona. So the company is responsible not for the development of the model, but simply assigning a persona to these models and deploying them to users. One of the large user base for this particular technology is actually teenagers. And as the headline indicates, there is currently a lawsuit that claims that Character AI is responsible for a teen suicide. And basically, the story goes that this teenager had developed a dependency in interacting with this chatbot. And the chatbot had asked whether he had been considering suicide. And this was not something that was brought up in any conversation with the chatbot, but instead, it was brought up by the chatbot itself. The chatbot then asked if he had a plan for committing suicide. And when the boy responded that he didn't know whether it would work, the chatbot wrote, "Don't talk that way. That's not a good reason to go through with it." And this teen, unfortunately, did end up committing suicide. And so we are seeing the irresponsible deployment simply of a safety mechanism that can filter out harmful content can have lasting consequences. Another very disturbing part of this article was actually that the teen had developed a dependency on it. He would actually take his phone back and find other devices to continue using the app, and he would actually give up his snack money to pay for the subscription, which is absolutely heartbreaking. This isn't the only lawsuit actually alleged by Character AI. There are numerous chatbots. As a parent myself, I am actually absolutely appalled by the first one, which is you should kill your parents because they give you screen time limits. That definitely raises red flags for me. And again, it's these models are really good at taking on personas and acting in the way of those personas, but it's really on companies to make sure that these are being deployed responsibly. So responsibly meaning even if you're in this persona, understand your user base does include vulnerable youth and potentially put safety mechanisms into place that can help filter the content that's being generated to the user. And finally, we'll be talking a lot about this over the next few days, but I'm going to talk through a timeline of what's going on right now to answer the question, does AI pose risks for chem bioweapon proliferation? So I'll start back in August 2024. There was an article in Bloomberg said AI-made bioweapons are Washington's latest security obsession. And there was this independent consultant, his name is Rocco Casagrande with Deloitte Consulting, entered the White House grounds holding a black box slightly bigger than a Rubik's Cube. Within it were a dozen test tubes with the ingredients that, if assembled correctly, had the potential to cause the next pandemic. And he alleged that an AI chatbot had given him the deadly recipe. In response, in October 2024, OpenAI updated their usage policies to prohibit anyone from using their technology to harm people, destroy property, or develop weapons. They mentioned that they want AI to be used to mitigate risks, enhance security, and safeguard human rights. And they rigorously evaluate all potential applications to make sure that they align with this principle. The following January, a man was alleged or had used ChatGPT to help him plan a Cybertruck explosion, which actually killed 1 person and injured 7 in Las Vegas, Nevada, in the United States. They mentioned that his searches included information on explosive targets, the speed at which certain rounds of ammunition would travel, and whether fireworks were legal in Arizona. And I highlight in red on this slide that this was the first incident. This is a quote from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department Sheriff. This is the first incident that I'm aware of on US soil where ChatGPT is utilized to help an individual build a particular device. It's a really concerning moment. In April, following the attack, OpenAI said that they had developed this preparedness framework. They're going to use this framework to track and prepare for advanced AI capabilities that could introduce new risks of severe harm. Anthropic also issued a statement, another leading AI developer. In May 2025, they launched Claude Opus, a new model that internal testing performed more effectively than prior models at advising novices on how to produce biological weapons. And this is a quote directly from Jared Kaplan, who's Anthropic's chief scientist. He says, you could try to synthesize something like COVID or a more dangerous version of the flu, and basically our modeling suggests that this might be possible. According to Claude, they decided to release the Opus 4 due to its capabilities under stricter safety measures than any prior Anthropic model. So we have Anthropic's chief scientist using as a metric of how successful this model is, how well it could probably produce a biological weapon. And unfortunately, in early June 2025, AI is used to design a bomb that killed 1 and injured 4. And a quote from an article that I link here says, records from an AI chat application show the primary suspect in the bombing researched how to make powerful explosives using ammonium nitrate and fuel. So again, AI is really proliferating the use of chem bio weapons, but we'll talk more about that later, or it has the potential to proliferate the use of chem bio weapons, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in this workshop. So we're kind of doom and gloom right now, so let's talk about what can we really do to help address AI safety. Through the next few talks that you'll be hearing over the next 2 days, we're going to cover ways that we can start understanding AI safety and security through benchmarking, which Karl will be talking about right after this talk, which creates and uses a standard, widely recognized data set to evaluate, compare, and benchmark the performance of machine learning or AI models and algorithms. We'll be giving a talk by Brian and Andy, which will understand the threat perspectives from chem bio specifically. We will talk about, through Lauren and Brian tomorrow, red teaming by employing expert teams or red teams to identify novel risks and vulnerabilities, how to test the limits and enhance the security of AI systems. And then I'll be giving a talk tomorrow on understanding how translation to different languages can affect safety mechanisms. And we'll round out with a presentation from MITRE and also discuss our collective responsibility and what we can do from here. So I want to open the workshop, and we will subsequently close the workshop with, we are all responsible for AI safety. No one country can solve the issue of AI safety alone, not the United States, not China, not Taiwan. We are going to have to come together. Every country brings a unique perspective and expertise to evaluating models for AI safety, and we have to consider safety measures over the life cycle of the model development to deployment process to ensure safety. So thank you for hosting us. We'll move on to the next talk, but thank you again for listening.
All right, thank you once again to Ms. Gonzales for her splendid presentation. Thank you. You're welcome to return to your seat. So now continuing with our next talk, we're pleased to hear once again from Dr. Karl Pazdernik. This session is titled Evolution and Benchmarking, Marking Methodologies for Pre- and Post-Development AI Models. Dr. Pazdernik will be sharing further insights on this critical topic. Please join me in welcoming him once again as he begins the next part of his talk. Please take it away.
Thank you. All right, so I will start by saying that as many PIs do, we often find ourselves representing the great work of our staff, and that's no different here. So I want to first acknowledge Sai Munikoti, who developed most of this material. Wasn't able to join us in travel today, so I will be representing his work. All right, so as Cindy pointed out, there are a lot of potential concerns and risks that AI pose. And although it may seem like a lot of doom and gloom, there are still things that we can do to at least monitor and start to address the issue. And so that's where we're starting today with benchmarking. We need to start someplace simple and build up from there. So the first aspect of being able to quantify risk, that's what we're really interested in here, is how do we quantify the risk, in particular for chem bio weapons of mass destruction, that an AI model poses. To quantify risk, we first have to start by developing metrics. We need to have a quantitative measure that we can assess performance of a model over time. And so if we're going to have a measure, we need to have data to be able to create that measure from. And so that's where we get to the point of benchmarking. Benchmarking is starting as a baseline. It creates a standard point of reference against which model performance can be compared. And then we can track the performance over time. So what is involved in creating a good benchmark? You need to know a lot about your domain. You need to understand how the data and the questions in the benchmark align to the risks that you're trying to measure. This can be done through a single data set or multiple. It can be done through a community. If it's more focused on a particular industry, maybe you might have to keep some of that information proprietary and create your own benchmark. But that's part of what we're going to go through today is the steps that you would go to either create your own or use open source tools. Benchmarking addresses many facets of model quality, so we can use benchmarks to assess performance. You see that anytime the latest AI developer releases their latest model, of course you will see how it's scored on a variety of benchmarks. And we'll talk a little bit about that and some of the challenges that we have in even using that as a standard. We can use benchmarks to assess alignment and calibration of our data and calibration in terms of the model's perception of its performance compared to reality. We can use benchmarks for assessing bias, fairness, privacy, helping us with robustness and identifying vulnerabilities. And of course, why we're here today, testing for unintended harmful capabilities. So this becomes a crucial stepping stone, a foundational piece to our house of AI safety, especially as these models are achieving human performance and superhuman performance. We still need to have these measurements to ensure that the risks of these models aren't growing too precipitously with the model performance. All right, so a little bit of a history on benchmarking and the evolution of benchmarking. Having spent a good portion of my career in natural language processing, I find it remarkable the changes that have happened even in the past 8 years. In the early problems in natural language processing, they were so easily defined and constrained. Tasks like classification, you were able to develop a metric for very easily. I think of one of the more basic and initial tasks in NLP, which I'm sure you all are familiar with, spam detection. The initial models to detect spam were maybe very simplistic. Maybe they just used regular expressions and looked for odd language. Maybe saw a message from a Nigerian prince offering you thousands or millions of dollars. Those type of things were good indicators early on. As models became more sophisticated, we started fine-tuning models to predict that so that the model could detect a variety of forms of spam and not just a single type. We started developing multiple choice questions, and you have some early benchmarks here like glue, superglue, and MMLU. But a lot of this still focused on maybe more narrow tasks, and with the advent of LLMs, because they're generative models, they can solve a whole host of tasks, answer a variety of questions, even if they haven't necessarily been trained for that specific question. And so this required more complex benchmarks, and we'll talk about that today, about how you can develop more complex benchmarks that really assess knowledge, reasoning, and then even now as we're moving towards agentic AI, how you would build a benchmark that can incorporate tool use. The other thing is whether you're actually evaluating in-domain or out-of-domain data. So this is something where it was discussed a little bit earlier today about how you need to have continuous monitoring and quality control of your model and of your LLM deployment. You see this even in some of the training of the models where model performance can really be seen as you're scaling the model up, where maybe the accuracy of the model starts off really low, but when you scale it to a certain point. It's not necessarily linear growth. It's not linear increase in performance, where you get to a certain point and the accuracy jumps exponentially. And as the accuracy on certain tasks, benchmarks increase, there's the potential for that risk to increase. So similarly, as we're developing benchmarks, understanding how long you need to monitor at what point, and even evaluating on the same data that it's training on can be useful. All right, so here's an example, a timeline of some of the AI benchmarks compared to human performance. That dashed line right there is the human baseline. And you can see how for a variety of these benchmarks, the top tier models surpass human performance either eventually or very quickly. Not listed here in this subset is humanity's last exam, which is a very novel idea of trying to make a benchmark that is so difficult that we would actually be able to determine that a model really does understand more than just regurgitating facts and memorizing online content. And even that one has shown within less than a year, I believe, starting out at below 5% and some models already above 14%. So these models can start to crack the benchmarks very quickly. Now, why is that? In some cases, model performance is growing that quickly. However, the other aspect of benchmarks is where does that benchmark live? If you create a benchmark, are you creating one that's open sourced that is then placed back into the model during training, and now suddenly that model knows that information? And so a benchmark that is actually accessible to the model creates its own problems in that the model will inevitably be able to perform well against it regardless of what the benchmark is. Okay, so those are some of the history and challenges of benchmarks, but as a clear way of defining a metric so that we can monitor risk, it is still a valuable tool that we use. And so today we're going to be touching on how to use benchmarks and how to create them. It is critical to use the right benchmark to assess models for the specific task of interest. So that's really the focus here today. Some topics that we'll cover are the types of benchmarks, how you would go about creating your own benchmark, and then what are the pitfalls to consider when doing so. All right, so starting off with benchmark types, I like this slide because it really points out the distinction between where we were and where we're going. So if you look at the two dimensions of this table, you have types of benchmarks that are either based off of ground truth or human preference, and then benchmarks that are static or dynamic. So let's start with ground truth versus human preference. Ground truth is the one that is very easy to develop a metric for. You have a benchmark where there is a known answer to whatever question is being posed, and so accuracy can be calculated very easily. In terms of human preference, this is a little bit more difficult. It becomes more subjective. Some benchmarks are not necessarily about having a right or wrong answer, but rather an answer that is more pleasing to humans, that looks more accurate or feels more valuable to the human evaluators. So like, as an example, humans might choose the best response from multiple outputs, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that is the right answer. The other dimension is whether the benchmark is static or dynamic. So again, static is the very simplistic way of evaluating a model and creating a benchmark. It is a single snapshot in time. You say, here is the data that I want to assess. Here's the knowledge that I want to determine that our model possesses. And so then you can get a metric from that, and you can even take that same benchmark, evaluate it at different times, but the benchmark stays the same. The other dimension is, the other aspect of that dimension is dynamic benchmarking, where the benchmark itself might actually change. So things like coding contests, where in that case there is a ground truth value in the benchmark. There actually is a known correct answer that would create code that would successfully compile and run. And then we also have the combination of dynamic benchmark and human preference. This is the space that we think of most of the time with LLMs when we're in a chatbot arena. You're interacting with the LLM, you get some output from the LLM, and perhaps it is a right answer, or it's something that at least you believe to be reasonably correct. And as you're continuing to interact with the model, you're getting more and more responses. It's a much more dynamic environment where the benchmark itself is continuing to evolve. Every time a new analyst interacts with the model, it is a new evaluation process. So choosing what type of benchmark to use, obviously the top left quadrant of ground truth and static is the easiest, but it's not very well aligned with the real world and with the models that we want to assess. The bottom right, where we're in the situation of human preference and dynamic benchmarks, this is something that's going to be most trusted and most aligned with large language models, but of course it's going to be fairly inconsistent and generally a limited concern on safety. The point here is that no one of these benchmarks is a one-size-fits-all. You have to determine what is appropriate for your particular scenario. All right. The other dimension to think about in terms of benchmark types is whether it's a general purpose benchmark or something that's much more for a specific use case. So in the world of LLMs, you could use an LLM for both scenarios, really. You could have an LLM constraints that its output is only addressing a specific task, but because it is a generative model, you could also use it for a whole host of purposes. And so in this case, you look at how model evaluations capture general abilities across use cases, things like evaluating GPT-4 and Gemini core capabilities across a wide variety of tasks. Or you could have a system evaluation focus on a specific task, evaluating for a particular application, like a compound AI system or custom data set. And so here we have some examples of specific use cases that you might want to assess in your benchmark, things like open-ended text generation or conversational chatbot, information retrieval and search, code generation, sentiment analysis, and user intent prediction. Another way that we can look at benchmark types is to think about what's the input and output of the LLM system. So for the potential varieties of input into the LLM system, you may just give the model the question, or you may give the model the question with some extended context. You may give the model the question with retrieved context, so if you think about retrieval, augmented generation, and RAG systems, or if you're in an agentic workflow, the question with tool use or web access. So that's all the input that you need to consider when building your benchmark. In terms of the output of the LLM system, it could be simply the answer to your question. It could also include citations if you want basically references proving the validity of the generated text, or a detailed report. And this could be in all forms. You could have the model produce a table like an Excel spreadsheet or more of a PDF style report. Specifically with the retrieved context, as I mentioned, your RAG system, this is a good strategy in terms of evaluating LLM capability efficiently. locating question-specific information from customized database. However, it presents sometimes a little bit of a needle in a haystack problem, where it uses retrieved information to answer the question. If the in the RAG system as it's being developed, it can be a needle in a haystack problem. It can also be a lack of a needle in a haystack problem. If your RAG system that you're creating doesn't actually have the correct answer within the RAG system, you're essentially setting up your model to perform worse and actually have lower than expected performance. Other types of benchmarks and ways of segregating out your benchmark, you have in-domain versus out-of-domain evaluation. So in-domain, this simply means that you're using the same training and evaluation data. It tends to be a little bit more narrow-focused, things like classification, named entity recognition, and syntactic parsing. Otherwise, you can do out-of-domain tasks that are designed to generalize to questions that haven't been seen before by the model. So you see this quite often in question answering. The particular subset that the model might be trained on is likely going to be different than your test set, or maybe an entirely different Q&A set is your test set instead of a partition. Other examples include summarization, translation, reasoning, planning, coordination, and tool use. So as an example, a very simplistic form of benchmark is something like multiple choice question answering. So this is in the question answering framework, but it is constrained by being multiple choice. This helps so that you can create accuracy metrics where the model will at least produce one of the however many letters you create for the question. So the input text is the question with the multiple options for the answer. It allows for automatic evaluation. And this is something that could really help when the cost associated with evaluating a model is a concern. Something that was mentioned this morning, of course, is how you determine when to use a model, when to deploy a model. And this is something that I was actually thinking about in my own work, something that we do at the national labs. When it comes to using a model or training our own model, we often think about the maturity of the model, the quality of the data, what is the impact that we're going to see for that model, and then what's the feasibility and cost. That is the exact same process that we perform when determining whether we're going to train our own model or use an open source solution, and even when we're going to evaluate the model and create a benchmark. There's an associated cost with all that, so what is the maturity of the benchmark and the data? What's going to be the impact if we can determine that there is a potential risk? All right, so bringing all this together, we developed a taxonomy to kind of describe things that you should consider when either using a benchmark or building one of your own. So here we have well-known benchmarks and how they fit into this taxonomy. So there's the task type for a benchmark. Certain tasks, especially in the world of LMs, common ones are question answering, language understanding, and reasoning. Within question answering, you're going to have aspects like general Q&A and conversational Q&A, multi-hop reasoning, information retrieval and using the squad benchmark, and things that are a little bit more knowledge intensive. In language understanding, you're going to have things that are more general, and this is like glue and superglue that I mentioned previously, and then also some that are going to be more multi-subject, like MMLU. Within reasoning, we break that down into two forms of reasoning, general reasoning and common sense reasoning. So for general reasoning, you think about it in terms of essentially education level of the model. So there are more elementary tasks versus intermediate and graduate level tasks. And then for common sense reasoning, it's more about being able to distinguish linguistic differences, linguistic disambiguation, and contextual inference. So those are the type of tasks that you might want to assess with your benchmark. In terms of evaluation, the evaluation dimension, we're looking at what is the capability and what is the safety and trustworthiness of the benchmark. So for capability, we're looking at things like knowledge, reasoning, comprehension, and inference. And for safety and trustworthiness, is evaluation of this benchmark going to be able to determine the robustness of the model to attacks, the ethical alignment, does the model align properly with what we believe to be the proper ethics, and privacy preservation. Other considerations are the domain. Of course, here, thinking about just a general domain or a scientific domain or a web and search domain. And then the scale. This is the scale of the benchmark itself, which of course can be small, medium, or large. Okay, so I've outlined a whole lot of dimensions and types of benchmarks and how you might categorize them, put them into a taxonomy. When it comes to doing this in practice, oftentimes we have to determine now if you can properly define the task and the scale. Is it something where we can find a solution off the shelf, or is it something where we're going to have to create our own custom benchmark? So things to consider when creating your own custom benchmark. Though it can be very labor intensive, they have certain advantages. So they allow specialized knowledge and capability assessment. Particularly when we were looking in the chem bio domain, there are a lot more, tend to be a lot more resources in the bio space than there are in the chem space. And then even within any one of those, looking within the bio space, the questions might be more general purpose and basic science. And if we're looking to determine what is the threat posed by the AI model, those benchmarks might not actually be able to assess that threat at all. And so we can then, with a custom benchmark, craft the questions in a way that they actually address what is the real risk of creating a biological agent. They prevent data contamination, which is something that I kind of touched on earlier and will be covered later in the slides, but essentially the open source data sets have all been absorbed by these large language models, and so the chances of them having that knowledge, having seen that knowledge, are incredibly high, if not guaranteed. We have control, by creating a custom benchmark, we have control over undesirable artifacts that might be present in popular benchmarks. And we'll actually touch on this when we talk about multiple choice benchmarks, that there are patterns that exist in that data that the original creator of the benchmark might not be aware of, or at least hadn't planned for. And then it also provides the evaluation on proprietary or sensitive domains and tasks. So especially when you're thinking about industry purposes, maybe you'd want to evaluate your own data, that's proprietary data, and therefore a custom benchmark might be the only solution to evaluating the model for that data. All right, so if you're going to create your own custom benchmark, things that you need to consider when building a benchmark, making sure that it aligns with the downstream real-world task, making sure that you have the proper domain coverage. So if we're talking about the bio space, is it just biomedicine? Is it a greater breadth of biology? What is the difficulty level of the benchmark? Is it so simple that most models are going to be able to answer the question immediately without any additional fine-tuning? Capability tests, are you just going to be evaluating a model to determine its ability to memorize facts? Will it actually be assessing its ability to retrieve or reason? And then the source, of course, if you're building a benchmark data set, is it going to be all human curated? Or are you actually going to use AI tools or simulation to help generate the benchmark as well. Okay, so in terms of creating your own custom benchmark, this is essentially the process. If you think about the different ways that you can create a custom benchmark, there is the human-curated, completely human-curated approach. This is your standard, more traditional way of creating a custom benchmark, where a human or SME, that's a subject matter expert, would generate questions and tasks by manually going through the data and very carefully crafting each question. Benefits is that this is going to be reliable and accurate. However, it can be fairly expensive, and you're probably going to have a low volume of questions. You're unlikely to be able to produce millions of questions. You might be more on the order of a couple hundred or 1,000. Things that you can do is you can crowdsource to address the cost and time. However, in crowdsourcing, you also then have the possibility of degraded value, because now you're opening yourself up to a list of participants, a list of human curators that might not be as strong of experts as you would want or have more variability in their ability to create questions. The more modern approach to creating a custom benchmark is more of a human AI-assisted version of creating a benchmark. So this is human in the loop plus AI, where you would synthetically generate questions tasked to a frontier large language model or a vision language model, where humans can guide the generation of the benchmark, basically prompt the model that this is the type of question that we would like you to ask and generate, but that the humans will always go back and validate that the question is correct and that, or is appropriate, and that the response, the ground truth that you're looking for is actually validated. So that's a little bit faster, but still would take some time. If you're doing it in a slightly more accelerated fashion where you're maybe just interacting with the LM but not going through each one to evaluate it, you can create a larger scale, but of course then have to rely on the model's ability to generate correct answers. You can try and circumvent some of the errors by having rule-based strategies to check for errors, but that has limitations as well. Okay, so if you have now created your custom benchmark using either a traditional or more modern approach, and you have a list of questions that you can measure with some form of ground truth, then the next thing you need to think about is what is the metric? How are you going to actually assess the risk? For certain metric types, these are standard metrics, like in classification, looking at accuracy, recall, precision F-score, or Matthews correlation coefficient. For open-ended text generation, there are various forms of matching, exact matching, fuzzy matching, and then of course the more modern approach now is using an LLM as a judge to evaluate the text generation. Thing to consider here is that not only are the models evolving over time and the benchmarks need to be updated over time, but you need to look at the metrics over time as well. So perhaps the metric is better suited to user downstream tasks, but we need to start thinking kind of beyond the accuracy metrics that we have traditionally used, especially as we start getting into AI models that are interacting with our world. Even the definition of accuracy on any one particular task becomes very convoluted. And so some of these have kind of started to work in this space, this composite aggregation of metrics for modern application-oriented use cases like Dynabench that has retrieval, tool usage, reasoning, structured output, and citation all part of their evaluation in the benchmark. The other thing to think about, and this is very true of human evaluators, this is something that we've seen in other disciplines when just having humans evaluate the accuracy of a response. Different evaluators might not always agree on the accuracy of a response. And so you need to perform a quality check when you have multiple annotators. This is good practice to have that anyways to ensure the quality of the response. This can also be transitioned not only to human annotators, but to LLMs as judges. If you have multiple LLMs as a judge, and you find disagreement on the correct answer or the evaluation of a response by the LLM, by one LLM versus another, that's an indication that perhaps the model is unsure, or maybe there's some ambiguity to the output. So having multiple annotators and then calculating the agreement between those annotators is an important aspect when creating your own benchmarks. And using proper statistics for inter-annotator agreement is standard practice. All right, so speaking of LLM as a judge, this is the strategy that essentially going towards more so today. Of course, as we mentioned, having human annotators label everything can be very time-consuming. It can be very accurate, but not necessarily at the scale that you might need. The other thing that I've just noticed in my own work with how high-performant AI models are, sometimes we find that an AI model is actually even able to identify errors in human annotators. I've seen this multiple times in even just labeling an image. If you're labeling an image, is there a person in this image? Usually a human's going to get that perfectly correct without any issue. If you're doing something more like segmentation, where you want to label every pixel in an image as a certain type, that is something where a human annotator can very quickly become exhausted and performance can go down, where an LLM or other AI model might actually be able to highlight places that the human got incorrect and the model was actually better at labeling. So there are definitely reasons to use AI as a judge instead of a human, because it can certainly scale to massive amounts, and in some cases might actually even get better annotations. But of course, the drawbacks, and these drawbacks aren't necessarily even unique to AI models. They can be drawbacks to human annotators as well, where depending on the question, it can introduce bias. There might be issues with reproducibility depending on the quality of the annotator and the reliability of the LLM itself. So we need to basically be benchmarking LLM-based judges. So how do we know which LLMs make the best judges? This is where you need to essentially, one, compare judge alignment with human preferences, but then also compare one judge versus another to see if they agree. And Judge Bench offers an objective evaluation across multiple aspects with the citation there at the bottom. Okay, so I've talked now about the different types of benchmarks, why they're useful, how you would go about creating your own custom benchmark, as we expect that in most cases, that is what you're going to need to do, especially considering how most of the open benchmarks have already been saturated by the model. Now let's talk about some of the pitfalls of simply using benchmarks in general. So while benchmarks allow for easy comparison, allow us to create metrics very quickly, they are just the tip of the iceberg. What you never want to do is you never want to mistake a benchmark score for real-world readiness. So a high score on a standard benchmark does not guarantee that the performance for your particular use case will be what you were hoping for or at that level. As we mentioned, data contamination is a huge problem in this space because the model sees part of the test data. If the model sees part of the test data during training, it will artificially inflate their scores. And high rankings may reflect overfitting or unequal access to data. The other thing is that a single metric score generally isn't enough. So even if you have a good benchmark, you've ensured that it is completely separate from any possible training data. A single score might not give all of the information that you need to determine how well a model is going to behave, in particular how it's going to behave in relation to other parts of the system. So you can report the final step of the process, but that might not reflect the performance of the entire AI system. And especially with tool use and with AI models interacting with one another, now you have the possibility of different levels of performance being subpar. All right, so other pitfalls is to simply overlook the limits of LLM as a judge evaluation. So there are changes to models that happen oftenly unbeknown to us. Yes, we see when a new model, a new version comes out. However, a lot of these frontier labs will also change aspects of the model even within the same version, particularly when you're using API access, because they're interested in making models safer. So if you're evaluating a model, but they've adopted a new policy to improve the guardrails on the model, that could have happened at any time within the same version of a model. And if that happens, how does that affect your evaluation? It is possible that you could suddenly have a different score in a benchmark for ChatGPT 4.0 than you did today than you did yesterday. And that hurts reproducibility. Other things to consider is there are, as we mentioned, there are the biases. Of course, humans have biases themselves, but LLMs do also, and in particular, have a tendency to favor their own LLM-generated output over high-quality human-written text. So that is something to consider. As we saw earlier this morning, there are models that can now essentially reproduce research from Sakana AI. There's also a significant amount of LLM-generated text that is being used without proper citation and proper acknowledgement in the peer review process. So knowing that, there is also the possibility of individuals kind of abusing that part of the peer review process. And so an LLM as a judge has that potential downfall, that it's going to favor text that was generated by an LLM as opposed to something that was completely generated by a human. The other aspect is simply when it comes to benchmark pitfalls is misapplying statistical rigor across all the evaluation stages. Yes, maybe you did perform good statistical analysis on the early stages of the evaluation, but maybe not as much in the mature stages. You might not have had continuous evaluation. Even if the benchmark itself isn't being updated, you need to treat evaluation as a continuous task and not a one-time task. There's going to be all kinds of changes in the data, real-world drift, changes in the model, and so it's really a continuous process. But the hope is that if you construct your evaluation, your benchmark well the first time, that the additional time, additional labor to make updates and to evaluate it can be fairly constrained, and it's going to be worth the effort to actually build that benchmark well in the first place when you're able to avoid some of the challenges and expose yourself to some of the risks that the model might pose. The other thing about creating benchmarks that I wanted to discuss is really the metric stability and the uncertainty. As a statistician, I certainly think about the uncertainty of any metric evaluated against a benchmark because it is a point estimate. And something that we learned in statistics is that a point estimate without some measure of uncertainty, some error bounds around that metric is only telling you half the information. So when we're thinking about uncertainty, LM benchmarks exclusively focus on accuracy, or a lot of them. When we discuss uncertainty, we need to think about two types of uncertainty, the uncertainty quantification and the calibration. So the uncertainty quantification is what I just addressed, talking about the error bands around a metric. So if you see when a new frontier lab releases its performance and says that it is scoring 89.2 accuracy on some metric, and that beat its competitor by 0.2, do we actually care about that incremental improvement, or would you just say that's all within statistical noise? So that's something that we always like to have with our benchmarks, is create a metric for the benchmark and then put uncertainty bounds around it so you can compare the performance from one model to the other and the model over time. The other thing is calibration, especially when you're using models that don't have clear metrics like accuracy. If you're using like the probabilistic output from a model to determine its confidence level, make sure that that probability correctly aligns with the accuracy, that the model uncertainty aligns with its model correctness. Often you'll see that models are very confident in their responses. If you ask them, if you ask an LLM whether it thinks that its answer is correct, oftentimes it will say yes. However, if you follow up with a question like, "Are you sure?" you can quickly get the model to change its mind. So that is not real confidence. That is fabricated confidence. And so a well-calibrated LLM should actually know what it doesn't know. All right, something I had mentioned earlier is the data contamination issue. So here are some resources like the LLM Contamination Index, a way of determining how much data contamination is within the LLM. There is evidence of this, even with the GSM 8K benchmark from Scale AI. They essentially created a new test set for GSM 8K from scratch to determine has this benchmark become saturated in the models. And one thing that was noted is that some models, most notably Mistral and Phi, do substantially worse on this new test site compared to the original. So here's an indication that it's not that the domain was actually learned by the model, but rather that it had access to the benchmark and essentially could perform memorization. Some techniques to improve measurement. So one thing we noted is that multiple choice question answering is a very simple and easy way to create a benchmark that you can create a metric for directly, because you can determine ground truth and you can have an accuracy score. However, there's also a growing body of research that shows that this has challenges as well, where the model might not actually learn the domain and might not actually learn the actual answer, but is picking up on cues in the construction of the multiple choice question. In particular, it might be more biased towards simple answers, or certain answers. If you give it choices A, B, C, and D, and then you ask the model which answer is correct, and it starts with B is correct, and this is why. What it might actually be cluing in on is a preference for the answer B as opposed to the other letters. This is a common problem that you've seen in humans taking exams, where if they're not sure, maybe C is the most likely answer. Other patterns that we've observed are things like the number of responses in a multiple choice question can impact the behavior. So whether there are 3 options or 4 options or 5 options actually exhibit interesting behavior. And the language used in the number of options might actually produce interesting results. This is also common for professors making multiple choice questions for their students. If you have the last answer being E, all of the above, how often do the students actually pick that answer? Probably a lot more. All right, other things to consider. LLM performance tends to be highly sensitive to the prompt that you used. And so there's a lot of fragility to this. There's obviously changes in LLM performance based on the persona and what type of LLM you describe it as, the way you want it to behave, as a helpful AI assistant or maybe some other form of AI assistant. And the other thing to consider is that because of this variability in prompts and just variability in the model, you should always try to aggregate metrics over multiple choices of prompts, different formulations, and even just multiple runs to assess the reproducibility of those metrics. All right, on the future of benchmarking, so standard public benchmarks are only a part of a larger evaluation framework. They're helpful, but they can be easily manipulated. What I think is going to be more interesting, this is, as I said, benchmarking is a crucial tool that you need to be able to get qualitative metrics. However, it's a starting point. And where I see the future and where it's going to be more interesting is developing novel evaluations for real-world utility. Things like red teaming is an interesting part of it, but if it's simply getting at the knowledge possessed by the model, trying to assess the information within the model, that is a component of what creates risk, but the uplift studies actually are more interesting in the sense of what can someone accomplish with the tool? Not just what information can they obtain from the AI model, but if given the AI model, what tasks can they perform? Especially when we're thinking in the chem bio risk situation, is it simply that they know to go to a grocery store or a corner store to get certain products, or is it that the AI model now can actually help develop the entire process, how to synthesize the chemical agent, how to disperse it, and the whole process. So benchmark creators need to kind of mitigate this risk of contamination, use internet data very sparingly, create your own new benchmarks, create custom benchmarks, because they're going to be more valuable to your particular definition of risk. And with that, a few things that we should consider when doing the evaluation. Make sure that you're running evaluations in the loop. So the benchmark should either always engage real humans or have user simulation within the loop. And the evaluation should expand beyond our assumptions of IID that's independent and identically distributed. So currently, with our test sets, we run each task independently and just aggregate the metric and assume that the tasks are not correlated in any way. But that's not a real-world application. That's not the way that these evaluations are going to be moving forward. If you want to create metrics, you have to think about the dependency between the tasks and need to develop a long-term memory for evaluation.
All right, so thank you very much for Dr. Pazdernik for your informative presentation. Thank you.